Assalamu alaikum. This is Nida Osman Chaudhry, and we are here finally with our very first session of the Water and Governance series that Maham Naveed, also our first speaker, has curated for us. We've been planning these series for a while now, and we're very excited that finally it's the 11th of June when the first of the sessions in this three-part series is going to take place. The first session talks about reimagining international water law in a polarized world. This is something which is very current, particularly in the context of Pakistan, because we're all aware of our Indus Water Treaty disputes with India. But as Maham has just mentioned to us as well, that this is not an issue that is just a bilateral issue between our two countries. It's a problem that many other countries are also facing. And in the next 10 years, water and its governance is going to be a really big issue. Possibly the next wars in the world will also be fought over this resource. So, as climate change, geopolitical instability, and growing water insecurity reshape the global landscape, the governance of shared water resources has become one of the defining legal and policy challenges of our time. To understand this landscape, we've organized these series, and the sessions aim to bring together scholars, practitioners, advocates, and emerging leaders to examine how international water law can evolve to meet contemporary realities. We're centering justice, inclusion, and cooperation, and we're trying to make sure that the series can explore the intersections of gender, human rights, and transboundary water governance in an increasingly polarized world. We're very happy to have with us Maham Naveed, who's a PhD candidate in global governance at the University of Waterloo. She completed her Bachelor of Laws from London University, sorry, from Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan, and her Master of Laws LLM is from the Yale Law School in the United States. Maham is a dual qualified lawyer in New York and Pakistan, but I got to know her when she was serving as the chair of international law at Islamabad Policy Research Institute. As chair, Maham spearheaded the institution's international law initiatives, including research and advocacy on international law issues. She was frequently called to provide policy advice on evolving geopolitical legal issues. But prior to her appointment as the chair, she also served as consultant on international disputes to the Office of Attorney General for Pakistan. During this time, Maham was part of the team that represented the federal government of Pakistan in the historic international legal cases before the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the International Court of Justice. Most prominently, Maham served as Pakistan's case officer for the Indus Waters dispute from 2019 to 2022. We're very happy that she's here with us today leading this series. Welcome, Maham. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me, Nida. It's always a pleasure to do things with you. I'm good.
You're good. Okay, so we are very excited that you're here with us, and this topic has, ever since we started talking about this particular topic, it has gained renewed attention, particularly in media as well, with all the news that's coming about our transboundary dispute with India. So there's a lot to unpack as far as this issue is concerned, and also because we know that there's not enough conversation happening on water in particular. I mean, as you yourself just mentioned, that there's been a lot of conversation on environment and climate in general in Pakistan being such a vulnerable country. But since, as you know, that the title of the session also is Reimagining Water Law in a Polarized World, before we discuss the major issues and the possible solutions, I'd like to ask what exactly has changed in the global landscape that makes reimagining necessary? And what are we reimagining really? Is there a water law? For the people who don't know much about it, if you could just start from the very beginning, that'd be very helpful. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Nida. And that's an excellent question. Whenever I've talked about reimagining water law, which partly my PhD is on as well, I frequently get asked this question. So I think it is important to begin by recognizing that international water law in itself very surely does exist, but it did not emerge in the world that we inhabit today. So many of the legal principles and international frameworks that continue to guide transboundary water governance were developed during a period when the central concern, I would say, was allocating and managing shared water resources rather than their sustainable development. And so, this divide rather than share policy is what initially water law meant to deal with. And while these principles still remain valuable to date, the context in which they operate has changed dramatically in the past, I would say, particularly 2 decades. So, and there are new challenges that are emerging that require the reimagination, as I would say. So, for instance, the first challenge would be climate change. And although we look at climate change independently, looking at it in the context of international water law, uh, international water law developed largely on the assumption that the hydrological systems were relatively stable and predictable. So that meant that the amount of water available was always going to be there. But today, as we are witnessing, that assumption no longer holds true. And across the world, we are witnessing prolonged droughts, extreme flooding, and changing rainfall patterns. There's glacier melting, and hence there's like growing uncertainty regarding the availability and the quantity of water available. So these issues become particularly problematic for transboundary river basins that cross national borders. So, and creates these distinct governance challenges that international water law has to now be able to deal with. Agreements that were negotiated decades ago were often based on like the historical flow patterns. As those patterns change, states are increasingly confronted with questions that existing and particularly the older treaties may not have even anticipated. So, for instance, how should water be allocated? When what will happen when the overall availability of water declines? How should states respond to sudden climate shocks? Does there have to be a collective response? Do there have to be unilateral responses? How can legal systems account for uncertainty rather than predictability? So, climate change particularly forces us not only to think about water management practices from the lens of the transboundary river itself, but some of the foundational assumptions that international water law was built on need to be reevaluated. Similarly, another major issue that requires this reimagination is growing geopolitical polarization, and I cannot stress enough on that. We're living in a period that is characterized by rising nationalism and populism. There's great power competition, and there's a decline in confidence in multilateral institutions. This has led to states increasingly prioritizing national interests and domestic political considerations over international cooperation. And this matters for transboundary water governance because this particular transboundary water issue is very, very dependent on international cooperation. And for instance, the duty to cooperate is now customary norm of not only international water law, but international climate law, international environmental law as well, as we also saw in the ICJ advisory opinion last year. So this cooperation comes in the form of effective, say, in the cases of waters, information sharing, consultations, joint decision making, long term engagement among all the countries that share a water resource, and multiple other ways that the cooperation could take place. And when political relationships deteriorate, water governance becomes more difficult. Existing legal frameworks may provide procedures and principles, but they cannot function effectively if states are unwilling to engage with one another. So, political will for engagement has to be there. The challenge today is therefore not simply a legal one, as it was initially understood. It is also a political challenge. Today's challenge is that international water law must operate in an environment where trust is often very, very weak between riparian countries, and riparian countries are countries that share a transboundary water resource. And so cooperation cannot be taken for granted. And similarly, in addition to polarization, another issue is the growing recognition of water as a human rights and as a justice issue. And this gives an entirely new dimension to the cooperation landscape. So, historically, international water law focused primarily on relationships between states. Increasingly, however, attention is being directed towards the impacts of water governance decisions on communities, individuals, indigenous communities, vulnerable populations such as women and children. So, because of this, questions of equity in water governance become central. For instance, who bears the burden of water scarcity? Which communities have access to decision making processes? Or how are interests of marginalized groups protected and accounted for? And the recognition of the human right to water by the General Assembly in particular has encouraged scholars and practitioners to think beyond traditional, like state to state frameworks, and to consider how governance actually affects people on the ground. What is now being called the rights based framework of transboundary water governance is a crucial component of the governance framework. And as a result of this rights-based landscape, contemporary discussions now all over the world with transboundary water resources increasingly emphasize inclusion, participation, and gender equity, which have become key issues that are going to go hand in hand with state sovereignty, which was the only defining principle initially.
Right. So there's a lot has changed, and I think there's been a lot of development in environment law, and as well as, in terms of water being a scarce resource now, where obviously the idea of water always being available has changed now over time with the kind of impacts that we've seen. So as you've mentioned, that there are a lot of reasons why this reimagining will probably be necessary now, as far as water law is concerned. But in your opinion, are existing treaties and institutions equipped to manage the increasingly complex transboundary water challenges, or are they struggling to keep pace with these changing realities that you have just highlighted? Because, I do recall that in the 60s, and around the time when international law was seeing it's probably a high point, we saw many newly independent states working within the UN system and using that platform for cooperation, for coming up with all of these different laws. And I think that period saw a lot of growth, a lot of cooperation, and a lot of these instruments, international instruments, being developed. But over the years, now that on the one hand, we have the need to reimagine these treaties or to look at them again, but on the other hand, that kind of political trust or that kind of cooperation between states is eroding day by day, and it's right before our eyes how that is taking shape. So in the middle of this kind of a political crisis internationally, and then uh, yet the need for that cooperation to be to be increasing every year, every sort of summer when we have this issue, how do you suppose we go forward from this? Because I mean, I don't know about the existing treaty mechanism and how broad those are to accommodate the kind of challenges that we have today. What do you have to say about that?
So I think if you would ask me, as lawyers, we say that was a yes or no question. If you ask me if it's a yes or no question, then it's both yes and a no. The treaties and institutions are equipped to deal with some challenges, but not all of them. So, on the one hand, existing treaties and institutions have demonstrated remarkable resilience, and we need to give credit to that. Many transboundary water agreements have survived wars, political crisis, and major shifts in international relations. A major reason for this has also been due to the continued relevance of principles that I spoke about earlier, such as, say, equitable and reasonable utilization, the duty to cooperate, prior notification, and most importantly, the obligation not to cause harm to someone sharing a resource with you. So, this shows that the foundations of international law, water law particularly, remain sound and are still applicable. However, we need to understand that what goes wrong is when we equate resilience with something being adequate. So, because many existing agreements were negotiated in a different era, as I spoke about earlier, they were designed around assumptions of relatively stable water patterns and were also very state centric governance structures. And today's challenges are fundamentally different. And because today's challenges are fundamentally different, many river basin organizations and treaty mechanisms are ill equipped and under resourced to deal with them. For instance, they often lack, particularly in developing countries, they lack robust monitoring systems, scientific expertise, enforcement mechanisms from a legal perspective, or sufficient political support to address all the plethora of governance challenges. In some cases, institutions are capable of facilitating dialogue, but lack the authority to address emerging domestic or international disputes effectively due to treaty designs or due to domestic considerations because of what is written in the law. At the same time, we live in an age where data sharing also remains a challenge. And as I said before, effective governance depends on a high level of cooperation, and that includes transparency. And UN Water and a couple of other water bodies have said you have to be transparent with data and information sharing. Only then can you share a resource rather than just dividing it. And so data sharing becomes a huge issue in a polarized world. And lastly, one of the most significant shortcomings is that many agreements focus on allocation rather than adaptation.
Hmm.
So they tell us how water should be divided under normal conditions, but they provide very limited guidance regarding what, say, prolonged droughts or unlimited rainfall or climate shocks or any other catastrophe. So they're not adaptable and they're not flexible that way. So this suggests that the future lies not necessarily in replacing existing frameworks, but in strengthening them. So the strengthening could come in the form of greater flexibility, adaptive management approaches, improved scientific cooperation, which is also significantly lacking, stronger dispute resolution procedures that have a stronger enforceability mechanism built into them, and also meaningful stakeholder participation, because in the world we live in currently, a lot of stakeholders that deal with water disputes feel that they weren't part of the conversation when water governance was being allocated and decided. So the challenge is therefore not that international water law lacks principles. It is whether the institutions can evolve quickly enough to address the realities that we live in today and to address all the interdisciplinary challenges that we have to face.
You know, the stakeholder point that you've raised is so true for any other sector also. You take it up, and it's always the policy and the governance is happening in such a disconnected fashion from the people that it's actually impacting, right? So I really wanted to ask you how you think can legal frameworks better, incorporate principles of equity, particularly for the vulnerable communities and the populations who are disproportionately affected by water insecurity. How can we include their voices? How can we include the principles of equity in such frameworks? Or is there a way to incorporate them in soft law forms, or in other ways, if not the hard law itself?
Thank you for that question, Nida, because I feel very strongly about stakeholder participation and water equity because I do believe that water scarcity disproportionately affects some people than it does others, right? So Equity has also internationally, because Pakistan is one country and India do share transboundary water resource, but there are more than say 200 shared water resources around the world. And equity has become one of the defining questions in contemporary water governance, because water insecurity is rarely experienced equally, and that is something that needs to be drilled into every international lawyer who wants to do water law, is that you can't now live in a time where you take a state centric perspective, where policies, as you said, are made in silos, and people who are going to be impacted with it have no idea what's going on. So, climate change, environmental degradation, and all kinds of resource scarcity often affect those who have contributed least to their problems. So, for instance, rural communities, women, indigenous populations, and small scale farmers and economically marginalized groups frequently bear the greatest burdens. You know how in the global south we say we bear the burden of the high carbon lifestyle of the global north. It's the same when it comes to water. So historically, international water law has focused primarily on relations between states. And while this remains important and very, very crucial to water governance, there has to be a recognition that governance frameworks must also consider how decisions affect people and communities. The question is, what should we do about it? So, one starting point is participation and the lowest hanging fruit, I would say. Communities that are affected by water related decisions should have meaningful opportunities to contribute to those decisions. Participation enhances transparency, it enhances legitimacy, improves outcomes, and it ensures that local knowledge is incorporated into governance processes, and so that governance processes are kind of like not blind to the people that they are going to be impacting. That is why a number of resource laws around the world have a legal requirement of consultation, which is to ensure that those who are impacted by the law and policy have an opportunity to provide input, particularly when we talk about indigenous governance. You have to consult, and there are legal requirements to do so. And the second consideration, in addition to participation, is access. The recognition of access to safe and sufficient water as a human right has reshaped discussions about governance and needs to be center and key to policy decision making. Water should not be viewed solely as an economic or strategic resource. It is essential for human health, human life, human dignity, right? So, legal frameworks should place greater emphasis on what we call now distributive justice. And by distributive justice, I mean the fair and equitable distribution of water. It's as simple as that. Policymakers are not supposed to ask whether benefits are being generated, but also how costs and benefits are distributed amongst people, right? So, who gains from the infrastructure project? Who bears the environmental risks of that? Worse off than they were before that decision was made. And lastly, the importance of gender. It again cannot be overstated. Women, and being this a women in law platform, it needs to be understood women play a key role in water collection, household management, agriculture, and community resilience. Some of the most resilient women I have met on the ground are women dealing with water governance issues from, say, the rural communities to urban infrastructure. Yet they remain highly underrepresented in many decision making processes. I myself have found myself to be in rooms where I am usually the only woman, if I am there at all, or else men making decisions of how water collection should be done. Whereas in Pakistan, most of that in rural communities is done by women. So, more inclusive governance structures can improve both the fairness and effectiveness, because you need to ask the person who actually does something what the issue is.
That is so
So,
true.
the crux,
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
sorry.
you can
So,
complete
the
your
crux
sentence.
of the issue I
I
was
was
going to
just
say is,
agreeing with you.
yeah.
Please continue your thought.
Yeah, so I was going to say that the crux of the issue is that equity cannot be treated as a secondary concern. It cannot be, oh, we've made the policy, now let's just see how it applies. No, it should be understood as a prerequisite for durable and sustainable water governance.
So I hear you when you say that participation is key, it's a low-hanging fruit, and there is a duty to consult as well. I'm thinking of course that the duty is on individual independent states to consult their people, but is there a way to actually contribute to the international sort of conversations or gatherings or forums where water law at a multilateral level is being discussed? Is there a way for people to add their voices in those forums? I know it's a bit of a digression, but I just wanted to understand who this duty is on and whether international forums themselves have the capacity to or the will to hear the people on ground.
I think that's an excellent question, and absolutely. So a lot of people and me myself wasn't aware of this, but there are so many organizations that are focused on women and water, right? So there's the Water in Women Diplomacy Network. There are regional organizations. There's one for South Asia. There one for Europe. There are a number in North America, and they have like regular meetups. I
Right.
wouldn't say it's possible for everyone to go, but it is possible for, say, a person like you who is in touch with the grassroots level, knows the issues that women face. And the issue is also not just the fact that women who deal with water issues have been left out of the conversations. It is also that women need to see a solid career in water governance.
Yeah.
They need to understand the importance of that, and the fact that is it can be a very viable and a crucial way to give back to a community that they call home, right? And definitely, and I know we're going to cover this in the next session as well on gender and women, and I do tend to flag that, but I would be happy to share an extensive list of networks and organizations that are just women centered, that talk about of equity in water governance, and particularly the role of women as participants, as recipients, and as lawyers. So, and I could share that list with you. You could circulate it for people who are interested. I could have conversations for people who are interested in having a career in it. But definitely there are platforms that you can go to, you can talk to, you can write to. So if you can't go, you can write to them. They can flag it with the UN Water, they can flag it with the Geneva Water Institute. So there's so many, and because they have the inroads, right? You
Yeah.
need to connect to that. That's how like a community also builds, right? And I feel like the water and women in law initiative would also be an excellent organization to connect and then become a conduit for women to get connected with other women doing this around the world.
Excellent. So we will be looking at you for helping us with that and for leading us on that, because these issues are just becoming so important that they can't be ignored anymore. But coming back to, the trust issues and, the politics around water and how this issue has been sort of reduced to a dispute between two states, as you've said. So at a time when this political trust between states is so often, short in supply, how can international law serve as a framework for cooperation and dialogue on transboundary water issues? I mean, what I'm basically trying to get at is that, is there any teeth in these treaties? And like you also mentioned that the enforcement mechanisms can sometimes not be as effective. So what can one do in that kind of a scenario?
So I this is a very interesting question, and I think first and foremost, what we need to realize is that international law, in essence, is built to basically give you predictability in an uncertain world, or at least it aspires to do so. You should be able to tell that if I do action A, it will result into B, right? This is right, this is wrong. So, at that point, trust between states is valuable, but it is also fragile, as we've seen. Because political leaders change, governments come and go, diplomatic relations fluctuate. But legal frameworks, on the other hand, and we've seen that with the Indus Water Treaty, provide continuity even when political circumstances become difficult. This is particularly important in the context of shared water resources. So, transboundary rivers, aquifers, and watersheds continue to exist regardless of political tensions. They are not going anywhere, right? So, states therefore require mechanisms that allow cooperation to continue even when broader relationships deteriorate. At this juncture, international law provides a common language and a shared set of expectations. Principles that I have spoken about before, such as equitable and reasonable utilization, most importantly, the duty to cooperate, information exchange, they all establish standards against which a state conduct can be evaluated and what the other state expects one to do. So it provides two things: clarity and consistency. However, it is important to realize that law does not eliminate conflict, is what a lot of people think that, oh, there's going to be a law, there's going to be no conflict. No, it provides a structured way of managing disagreement. For instance, water treaties often establish joint commissions, technical committees, other mechanisms, and dispute resolution procedures. The idea of these institutions is to create regular channels of communication that can help prevent misunderstandings and from disputes escalating into full blown, say, like, God forbid, armed conflict, right? And at the same time, along with legal cooperation, what I feel like we don't talk about enough is that the role of technical joint management cannot be underestimated. It has to go hand in hand with legal cooperation. In many river basins, engineers, scientists, and water managers continue working together even when political relations are strained. And we've seen that around the world. And technical collaboration can actually help preserve communication and maintain a degree of trust. And the Indus Water Treaty is frequently cited actually as an example of that.
Yeah.
So, despite repeated political crisis between the two countries, institutional mechanisms have continued to provide some kind of framework for engagement, whether now it's broken or whatever, but there is, like, they're still going before the neutral expert, so there's some kind of engagement before a common body. However, with, as we've seen with the Indus, and it's a prime example, we know that the law has limits. So international law cannot create political will. It can structure it once there is political will, but it can't create it where there is none to begin with, right? So we've heard slogans like "water and blood will not flow together," right? So you can't, law can't create that, the sentiment for cooperation. And cooperation so ultimately depends on states recognizing that collaboration serves their best interests. So, what I'm trying to say is that law is most effective when it complements political commitment rather than attempting to replace it, because, as we've seen in international law and voluntary enforcement, it cannot replace it. In a polarized world, this function of law becomes most important because international law may not solve every dispute, but it can provide the structure, the predictability, and the, say, procedure safeguards that is required to keep cooperation alive and going.
Also, I
So
think
in that
legitimacy, I think the question of legitimacy also becomes important because, like Pakistan's feeling so vindicated on its stance if some international forum comes and sort of stamps on its stance and says that, okay, yes, they're in the right, a treaty can't be suspended, so on and so forth. So I think sometimes you need like a third party or some sort of a framework within which or against which you can weigh in whether your stance has any merit or legitimacy or not. I mean, I don't know if that's something because I remember Emir Bilal Sufi Saab also used to say that breach of treaty is a perception of the adversary. And
Mm,
it's always, there are two sides to every conflict, and every every person, every state interprets the treaty from the perspective of their own national interest as well. So these are tough questions, but recent tensions surrounding the Indus Water Treaty have raised questions about the durability of water sharing arrangements. And since you've also mentioned Indus Water Treaty, this is what I want to now really get at, which is what I think Pakistanis really want to know, because right now this is their main sort of a bone of contention with India. And every other day we're hearing about, Pakistan should be ready to bomb the infrastructure that India builds around on those rivers. And so the conversation just escalates to bombs and armed conflict so quickly, so rapidly, without first resorting to whatever existing channels one has through these forums. Also shows the dwindling trust in international law. But really, what do you think is the durability of these water sharing arrangements in politically polarized environments? And what does the Indus experience tell us about the relationship between geopolitics and water governance? Because the sentiment, if the law cannot sort of bring in that sentiment and only bring a framework or a structure, then what really do we have when trust and relations between a state, uh, falls down to the level that it has between India and Pakistan? What do we do then?
So I think also, before we give like South Asia a bad rep, I continue saying that Pakistan and India, we're also more like, we also know more about it. But honestly, water disputes that have also actually turned into violent conflict have happened all over the world, right? So I just want to just be the first person to acknowledge that and be like, they've happened in Africa. Okay, not violent conflict, but very severe tensions between on the Nile River between Egypt and Ethiopia. And so the idea is there have been water disagreements between India and China. So the idea is that water is something that generally is going to say strike a nerve with countries, just because it sustains human life. So you cannot just take it, I would say, like you take other issues, because countries really, really want to protect the water that they have, particularly in times of water scarcity. At the same time, when you talk about the Indus experience actually offers a fascinating and at the same time important lesson about the complex relationship between geopolitics and water governance. And on the one hand, it demonstrates that water can remain a platform for cooperation even when political relations are deeply strained. But on the other hand, it reminds us that no water agreement exists in isolation from the broader political environment in which it operates. And the Indus Water Treaty, I think it's important to acknowledge, is often cited as one of the most successful examples of transboundary water cooperation in modern history. The treaty historically has survived wars, it has survived military confrontations, diplomatic crises, and decades of fluctuating relationships between Pakistan and India.
I just
I would
want to
actually
put
say,
your thought there, Maham. All of that the survival of the Indus Water Treaty during those wars and stuff was happening at a time when environment and water scarcity and all of that had not reached the kind of pinnacle that it has reached today. So, do you think that going forward also we can see same kind of um, resilience of the Indus Water Treaty between these two countries? Or do you think that, it survived all of that at a time when climate and water environment had not become that big of an issue? So now that those dynamics have changed, will we see a more radical response, or, a more endangered environment for the treaty to operate in? I mean, you can finish your earlier thought, but also then sort of look at it from this perspective that our increased environmental concerns and climatic conditions leading to this treaty and its survival being put into question even more than, like earlier years or previous years, like when you compare the two sort of eras together.
no, I actually think that's a very good question. That because it now pivots me to talking about something I hadn't thought I'd talk about, which is that I do agree that water scarcity and environmental degradation are at a point where the what we call resource wars are more extreme, right? Because you need to, but we cannot. But the resource wars are happening, say in all over the world, right?
Yeah.
But why is the geopolitical tension here so extreme? Because I don't know whether a lot of people would be um, familiar with it, but there are things we call as threat magnifiers. And political polarization and populism is a threat magnifier. So when you talk about the fact of the environment that we agree in, you spoke about the environment that we live in, you spoke about the resource scarcity, but you cannot take away the impact of populism from that.
Yeah.
Populist leaders are cropping up all over the world, and what does populism do? It is essentially a break from multilateralism towards kind of like a nationalism where your own, like me, my own, is more important than anything else. We're seeing what the United States is doing right now. It's a pivot away from the water governance thing, but it ties really well into it because international water law, Indus Water Treaty, the Mekong Basin Commission, the Nile Basin Commission, whatever, all of them are built on essentially a framework that encourages international cooperation. When you shake the ground of that cooperative framework, you're essentially shaking all of everything above it, right? So be it water governance, be it environmental governance, be it governance on climate change, trade, like mobility, migration, you pick it. So whereas the resource disputes have become more extreme, you will realize that a lot of regional organizations are still operating very effectively, because what the break from multilateralism has also resulted in is more regionalism.
Mm.
So the European Union being a very good example, which deals with a lot of water issues amongst the European countries. So when we talk about the Indus Water Treaty, I think one of the reasons that I spoke about the historic resilience of the treaty was because the treaty did establish clear rules, defined rights and obligations, and did create a very, very strong institutional mechanism through which disagreements could be managed. So the Permanent Indus Commission regularly exchanges information, or was meant to do, has a rigorous dispute resolution process, has an open channel of communication, and has worked even when broader diplomatic engagement was limited. So this highlights an important point that effective water governance is not necessarily dependent on perfect political relations. Well designed legal frameworks and the political will to implement that framework, the political will is what is shattered when populism comes into the mix, can create a degree of stability and predictability that allows cooperation despite there being water scarcity, right? So although the recent challenges surrounding the treaty demonstrate that legal frameworks are not immune to geopolitical realities, the treaty needs to be implemented in an essence of international cooperation, and that essence is not, right now, what there is missing, because water scarcity is going to hit everyone. You still need to cooperate to deal with that, like you need to cooperate for climate change. The International Court of Justice particularly said that states have a duty to cooperate to ensure and to mitigate the impact of climate change. It cannot be more clearer than that. You cannot do it alone. So the idea is that water governance ultimately does operate within a political context. And when relations between states deteriorate, disputes over infrastructure projects, data sharing, in this case, treaty interpretation, and constraints, they've actually become entangled with broader strategic concerns, and the muddling is where the issue happens. So water may not be the cause of the political tensions, but it becomes a very solid arena where the political battle plays out, right? And the
Yeah.
Indus is a prime example for that. The reason I do talk about the Indus as well is because it gives a very good example of how water and politics go hand in hand, but can also is also a good example of a solid treaty that, if implemented, can lead to kind of a workable solution.
Hmm.
So what the Indus basically does, it challenges the simplistic narrative that water either causes conflict or promotes cooperation. When you Google water governance, the two words you're going to see are conflict and cooperation, because they're like water either does one of those. So it in reality, water can do both, right? And water can do so much more than that. And and the Permanent Indus Commission also shows us that the role of institutions in this is most important.
Hmm.
Ultimately, I think the most important lesson of the Indus waters is that water governance is not simply about water. It is about the law. It is about institutions. It is about diplomacy. It is about your national commitment and international commitments. And lastly, it is about the willingness of states to recognize that long term cooperation will always serve their best interests than short term confrontational or unilateral gains.
That's
And
so
I think that's the treaty's most important contribution right now.
absolutely. I agree with you there. I just have last two questions to put you, and then we will open the floor for for our participants to put any questions to you. So just bear with me for the last two questions. I might just put them together and you can answer them collectively if you want to, because I think that they can be addressed together. The first is, what emerging issues do you believe will have the greatest impact on water governance over the next decade? And then, what gives you the optimism about the future of international cooperation over shared water resources despite these growing geopolitical divisions? So, on the one hand, emerging issues, and on the other, are you optimistic about the future of water law? So, if you could just answer them collectively, we can then move to the participants who've been very patiently hearing our conversation.
Fantastic. So, emerging issues very quickly in 5 minutes. So, I've actually spoken about a couple of emerging issues. So, I'm going to very quickly list them. I think the first and perhaps the most important one is climate change and hydrological uncertainty. Many existing transboundary agreements are negotiated on the basis of historical averages that needs to be reevaluated, and the climate change will alter also river flows and the quality and quantity of water. So states will increasingly confront questions that traditional governance systems are not designed to answer. Another major issue is the growing demand of water by population growth, urbanization, and economic development. So, the global population continues to increase while cities are expanding at an unprecedented rate. And at the same time, rising living standards and industrial development are generating greater demand for water intensive goods, energy production, and agricultural output. And when we talk about water intensive goods and services, let's just like AI is an
I
entirely
was
different
just gonna
topic,
say that.
right?
I was just gonna say that. Yeah.
We could actually do like an entire session on
On
the use
exactly. Yeah.
water and the
Water and
use
AI.
of.
Absolutely. Why not?
And yeah, and the last issue I think is very important and doesn't get enough attention is data technology and digital governance. So, technological advancements are transforming our ability to monitor and manage water resources. Satellite imagery, remote sensing technologies, artificial intelligence, and say predictive modeling are providing unprecedented insights into the hydrological system, which we didn't have before.
Hmm.
So, these innovations offer tremendous opportunities for improved decision making and strengthening cooperation. And the last, I think, question was on optimism. Am I optimistic? I wouldn't want be working towards doing this for the rest of my life if I wasn't. So yes, I am optimism. I think one of the reasons for my optimism is that history provides evidence for it. Around the world, many transboundary water agreements have survived periods of severe political tension. This still currently are non-state actors, other states are intervening to make sure that political tensions do not become full blown out wars. So that means that there is the international will to somehow find a governing framework of water. The second is the growing sophistication of water governance institutions, legal, technical, environmental, geometrical, like all of them. So these institutions if used properly, can create regular interactions and for technical cooperation and help ensure cooperation. And I think my last I think the cooperation is that optimism comes from the fact that water can be a dividing force, but water can also be a community building aspect. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, and for women, water can bring together communities to solve a shared problem, and in that way provide a platform for diplomatic exchanges and for international cooperation. But I still want to flag that none of this means that cooperation is guaranteed, by the way. There will be disputes, there will be delays, and there will be periods of political unrest. And there are situations like climate change that would intensify that. But I think in the polarized world that we live in right now, the most important and the most realistic form of optimism is not the expectation of perfect harmony, but the confidence that cooperation will continue because shared natural resources make it necessary for you to work towards for a sustainable world, which we know the importance of now. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have a few questions for you in the chat also, but if anyone who's here wants to unmute themselves and ask it directly, please, the floor is yours. Ji Khatija?
Hi, thank you so much for the session. It was actually really informative. I just wanted to ask, in terms of international cooperation and international political will, for example, I work on climate displaced communities and climate migrants specifically. So we do see that there is a lack of recognition and lack of will in terms of still including that segment of affectees within the frameworks, although there is a humanitarian angle to it where we do try to cater to such people. So generally speaking, in terms of international will, even if it is there in documents and allegedly they speak of it, in terms of practicality, for example, the third world countries, for example, Pakistan or um, the Pacific, islands in the Pacific, we do suffer more. And in terms of the West, they don't really seem to have an intention, largely, especially if you look at negotiations, to actively take responsibility. Discretionary support, yes, is there, but in terms of responsibility, that is why often negotiations also are not concluded because there is a lack of will to take responsibility. So, in terms of that, is there, of course, we can't do anything but to hope for the best. I feel like that's the only way forward for us. But in terms of that reluctance to take responsibility, where do we see the international will coming from? Because I don't see where we can get, if we can't get them, like all stakeholders involved on the table to agree to some extent, where do we find a solution?
um Thank you, Khadija. That's a fantastic question. And I think what you're talking about is the international will for climate displaced refugees or migrants. Am I correct?
Yeah, that, and generally also in terms of like, for example, the ICJ opinion came out last year, and the negotiations for UNFCCC were happening. And I was following the negotiations, and I remember like a lot of countries. So we were following the loss and damage negotiations, and the unanimous vote that was passed was to not include the decision in the preamble of the text of the negotiations because it did not reflect, the ICJ opinion was not reflective of the opinion of all the countries involved at the UNFCCC. So that
Yeah.
kind of was a bummer. So in terms of that, if we look holistically as well, how how is that, of course, it's a welcome opinion and it does do a
Yeah.
lot for us. But at UNFCCC level, where we're looking at international cooperation, yeah.
Uh, okay, great. Also, on your word that it was a bummer. I think if you want to do international law, you have to get very very used to that thing. A lot of things being a bummer, particularly if you
Fair
want to do
enough.
it as a career. I think that's a fantastic question, and I think there are a number of issues to that. The first is the climate displaced refugees, right, or migrants, because we can't call them refugees because they are not
Yeah.
recognized as refugees in the Refugee Convention, and so back and forth on that issue is a completely different thing. And because they're not recognized as refugees, they do not get the
Yeah.
protections that refugees do get.
Right.
I think one of the important conversations that have been happening on this regard is that we need to have more regional frameworks in place, right? So there are two kinds of climate displacements. There are internal displacements that
Yeah.
happen within the country, which fall within the sovereign prerogative of the country to deal with. And then there are international displacements that, because, say, the island of Tuvalu, which is going to be completely wiped off the map, right?
Yeah.
So
Kiribati.
I think in the case of the Pacific Islands, I would start with that. I think, like for instance, with the Tuvalu example, there have been conversations with the citizens of Tuvalu getting like nationality of either New Zealand and Australia and being reallocated there. I don't really agree with the way they're doing it. It's kind of like, from what I've heard and read, a lottery system, where it's kind of like also like a survival of the fittest kind of a thing, where people who can earn, who are healthy, who are more able to adapt to the community will be taken up, and the Tuvaluan government will have to figure out what to do with the rest of them. But that being said, the framework is problematic, but the framework is there. You need to recognize that. So the idea is that when push comes to shove, I do think that there may be not like international will on the larger scale, but there
Mm.
are certain countries that would step up, like Australia, New Zealand have in the Tuvaluan example. On your larger question of cooperation, the UNFCCC and the climate change advisory opinion and all of that, and I spoke about in the water context right now as well, Khadija. Cooperation generally is very, very, very thin right now, and it's just also the result of the world that we inhabit currently. Currently, we do. We can put we can place the United States as one of the countries that has broken away from international cooperation, but honestly the rise of populist leaders around the world is happening, right? So we kind of have found ourselves right now in a world where national sovereignty while being also violated to the extreme for states has still become kind of like the most important factor in their international dealings. And so in that sense, I think there are two things that that the world could do, or that developing states can do or should do. Number one is rigorous international institutions. International institutions like the UN, we've seen, are toothless, but international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, we've seen, can shake enough leaves if they want to, right? So I feel like having more rigor in international institutions, if the Western international institutions don't do it, there's nothing.
Mm.
The regional international institutions can always step up, as the Asian Development Bank has. So there are examples of that. And then also the third world, as we've seen in the ICJ case, also there needs to be more regional approaches to international law and international cooperation. International law was like kind of like a one model fits all model when you initially said, and that is why this international law has strong underpinnings of imperialism and colonialism. And the
Mm.
third world approaches to international law kind of like is has come about at a very good time, where we can we can use that to come up with approaches of international law that are more responsive to the needs of the third world or the developing states, as we say that. So I
Yeah.
would put like the third world approaches to international law, more regional cooperation, stronger institutions as some things that could potentially, again, not fix everything, but could potentially come up with like a working solution.
Thank you so
Okay.
much, Maham, for
Yeah.
that. Khadija, do you have a follow-up question, or can I move to the next question?
No, you please move on to the
Okay.
next question. Thank you
Great.
so much.
So Dr. Fiaz has left a question in the chat. He says, if a country is heavily reliant on inflows coming from other countries, transboundary basins, why not utilize the rainfall occurring within the country's boundary?
So the rainfall occurring within the country's boundaries also kind of is, it's not an international water law issue, it's a domestic law issue, right? So it's a domestic law issue considering your capability of harnessing or utilizing that the water or being able to store it. And honestly, I don't think there's anything, I don't think why a country should not do it. So in law as well, the general perception is that you need to do everything to mitigate your damage. That's what the court also says when you go to court, right? They're like, what did you do to stop it? Did you just keep on sitting there and let the damage occur? So absolutely. But I feel like internal politics play a very strong role in the question in this particular situation. And what would be needed in that situation is the fact that a country needs to be able to have a solid domestic water governance system and infrastructure to do that. Another thing I feel like a lot of people don't realize is that they're like, oh, why didn't the country do that? Or why didn't the country do this? Or they could have done that. Countries do not have the capacity, a lot of them don't. And I feel like what I said to Khadija as well, international organizations can step in at that point in time, because there, yes, a country can utilize the rainfall occurring within its boundaries, but what if it doesn't, just does not have the capacity to do that? It needs help. And that's where I feel like more regional and more like cooperative based mechanisms are important, because political will is one thing, but the ability to do something is another. Yeah.
Okay, there are two questions by Zainab Akram. The first is, can long-standing water treaties remain resilient in the face of changing geopolitical and climatic conditions? I think this we've already answered through
Yeah.
I think even when I was grilling you. The second question is, how can emerging technologies such as satellite monitoring and AI improve compliance and water governance? So if you could answer the
Oh,
second question, yeah.
I definitely can. And they absolutely can. I think a lot of the treaties that were previously negotiated, and I'm just going to like touch on her first question as well, were done on the face of the fact that, oh, this is the hydrological cycle, right? And like this is what we can see. And but the idea is that satellite monitoring and AI, particularly, the predictability becomes a key issue in a water treaty. What in essence a water treaty wants to do is ensure that it can deal with all kinds of water issues that come up within two countries, right? I think what these emerging technologies do is that they do two things. They make it easier to predict what's going to happen, and secondly, they make the entire situation more, say, transparent in a good way. Like countries can't pick and choose data to give the other person, right? And international organizations also play a huge role in this, in the fact that the you can only make a contract once you know the entire picture. So when you come to a lawyer for an issue, you're like, oh, this happened, but the lawyer is going to be like, no, you tell me everything, right? Because I need to know how X, Y, and Z will impact your current issue. And I feel like technologies enable us to do that. Data gathering, more data on related issues like rainfall, climate change, even biodiversity. Say, the fisheries convention is very important. We're seeing issues with the straits. All of that makes it predicting and looking at a larger governance structure makes it possible for us to have more resilient water treaties. They were like, oh, any issue that comes up, our water treaty can solve it, basically. Yeah.
Excellent. So, does anybody have any other questions? If not, Maham, I have one last thing for you to touch upon, and that is about our next two sessions in the series. And if you want to kind of just give like a sneak peek into what the next two conversations hold in this series, and by when can people expect to hear from us on that. So if you could just sort of excite them a little bit about the next two sessions, and then we can call it a day.
Definitely, Nida. I think so. We're going to have the first series, which was like an introduction to water law, is going to was to just set the ground running. We're doing a series on water governance just to make people, one, aware of the issues, and second, just to help them understand what the larger conversations are. We're going to have another session on women, gender, and international water law. So, which is going to basically focus on the fact that how gender and water scarcity interact, and what the governance mechanisms for that need to be. And if I am correct, the last session is going to be on water governance in from a rights and an environmental perspective, and that's going to be talking about what is most important right now is the rights-based approach to water governance. We're going to have one in July, we're going to have one in August, and I think we're going to announce the dates in another week or so, and also the speakers for those series. Lucky for you, I am not going to be the speaker, but I will be part of the conversation, and I will be co-moderating that with Nida. But we will have an excellent lineup of lawyers, policy practitioners, and people who work on the grassroots levels to talk about these issues, and how you can have and how water governance holistically can solve a lot of problems. And anyone who wants to stay connected is happy to do that. If you're looking for to start or continue with a career in water governance, happy to stay connected and happy to have a chat with you on that, because Pakistan would really, really benefit from having increased water expertise in all fields, be it legal, technical, political. So that's that.
Absolutely. On that note, thank you so much. So yes, next sessions in July, we will be communicating, all other details about its timing, speaker sessions on our social media and across all our pages. We look forward to you all continuing this journey with us in this entire series, and please let more people know about it as well, because we think that, like AI, like space law, like water law, like these are all issues that are emerging issues, and all of them are extremely important for Pakistan. And the more people can sort of get to know about these, the better. And we'd like to sort of build a community of sorts through these series and sessions of like-minded people who are interested in this field in particular, so that we can continue building expertise and capacity. So yeah, please stay connected. Thank you all for tuning in today as well. I know Lahore में इस वक्त बहुत अच्छा मौसम हो गया है. It's really nice. All of a sudden after the storm, it's really pleasant. It's raining, so the temperatures have cooled down a bit. And still you guys chose to stay with us. So thank you so much for that. And thank you, Mama. This has been extremely informative. I personally learned a great deal. Have a nice day now. Enjoy your rest of the day, and hope to see you in July with the next session as a moderator. Have a nice day, everybody else as well.
Thank you so much, Nida. Thank you for putting this together. Thank you.
No,
Bye bye, everyone.
pleasure.
Thank you for
Khudafis.
being here.
Khudafis. Take care.
Love.